So today we are speaking with one of the producers of a wonderful piece and director of a wonderful piece called A Frequency at Lavernock, which is a performance piece inspired by a ghostly fairy tale from the coast of Wales. And with us today is Tracy Spottiswoode, who is an award-winning director who's worked in film, animation, TV, theater, radio, and in immersive XR. And she began as an actor and worked with companies like Volcano and Cardiff Lab and many others, and studied in former Czechoslovakia and so on and so forth. But the main idea today is to talk about how this piece looks at culture, language, and capturing the spirit of a place and time and of people. So I wanted to welcome you to the show and thank you for being a part of FIVARS this year.
Thank you. It's a great honor. I was really, really pleased to be selected.
And you said that there are fireworks going off where you are today. Why is that?
That's because we've got Guy Fawkes Night next week, and people just get very excited and start letting off fireworks beforehand. So
yes, remember.
That's what it
is. So tell us a little bit, for those who aren't aware, tell us a little bit about the area that you live in and its, let's say, its history, its geopolitical history, and maybe its culture.
Wow. Well, I live in Wales, and Welsh is the oldest living language in Europe. And it's way, way older than English. And originally, the British Isles were pretty much colonized by the Welsh and the Celts, if you like, the Welsh, the Scots. And then, various invasions pushed us further and further to the west. But Welsh is still very much a living language. We have a Welsh television channel, and the TV and film industry is fairly thriving here. But it's very, very new to have it in VR. So I think this is the first ever 360 VR piece that features Welsh language.
Yeah, it's always a scary thing in VR to say it's the first ever, but often it is. You never really know, but it's sometimes you can actually make that assumption, which is extraordinary. So tell me, how did it arrive to the ecosystem? Did you bring it in? Did you bring the notion of capturing a project in 360 into the environment, or was it bubbling up on its own, or when did this project arise?
Well, I started off as an actress and a set designer, actually, and sometimes both at the same time. And with the theatre companies that I worked with, we often did site-specific immersive pieces, very often in the landscape. And so I was really interested in how I could create that kind of thing in VR. I mean, I've been a filmmaker for some years now, but I've never lost that love of, the immersion that you get with theatre. And when I was working with Cardiff Lab, we had a company from Colombia over to do a residency with us called Imagen. And they built this incredible kind of labyrinth where you traveled through it as the audience one by one, and you entered different spaces, and you interacted with the set or the actors that were in the space. So, you could pull this drawer open of this dressing table, and a hand might appear and offer you a necklace and that kind of thing. Or you went down a chute and you ended up in a sort of pit in the dark of coffee beans, and the smell was incredible. And then you realised there was somebody in there who was pouring coffee beans over your head, and you had to get to the centre of it where the Minotaur was, and it was incredibly immersive. And so I then went on to create some pieces like that. I worked with a group of Czech actors and drama students at a theatre the east of the Czech Republic, and we created a piece that went under the stage in the theatre and went through, again, a lot of different spaces that were connected to the history of that town, and some of the characters that had lived there, but it was kind of based on Alice Through the Looking Glass. So a few years ago, I won a Creative Wales Award, which meant that I had enough money to live on for about a year and a half. And I could do a lot of research into narrative storytelling in XR. That was what I was interested in. And what I really loved was the potential of VR to connect with that kind of immersive theatre. So I approached the piece as I would a theatre piece. I had a site in mind, which is just along the coast of South Wales, where Marconi sent the first ever radio signal across water in Morse Code. And on the cliff there is a church called St. Lawrence, and I'm a trustee of the church. My late husband, his remains are buried there. And so I knew that I had access to this church for rehearsals, to work in, and to create a piece that was inspired by that place, its history, and everything, around there. So we filmed in the church, we filmed on the beach, we filmed at a gun emplacement just along the coast. And it was fantastic not to have a script from the start. We worked like I would in theatre, so that we devised it. We did a lot of research. We looked at the gravestones in the graveyard and the stories of the people who'd washed up on the shore, or who'd been sailors, or who had been refugees who'd drowned trying to reach the coast, and ghost stories and legends, and of course all of our kind of preoccupations and memories and histories that fed into it, as well as the Marconi story.
Wow. There's so much to process in there.
Yeah, that's a lot. Wasn't it?
And so you in the piece that you've submitted and that we're showcasing, we end up at this particular beachside location, or we sort of more like a rocky ocean side, I guess it is. Is it an ocean or a lake?
It's the Bristol Channel, which then goes into the Atlantic. So it's the beginnings of the ocean. But that part of the coast there is it's very interesting, because it's got one of the greatest sort of tidal drops in the world along there. And actually that bit of beach that we're on, Marconi couldn't get the signal from the island across. You can see the island if you look, in the piece. So he couldn't receive the messages that were coming from the island because he was on the wrong frequency. They didn't know at that time about frequencies and wavelengths. But he had this idea that maybe he should go down to the beach. And of course, by going down the cliff to the beach, he lengthened the aerial, which meant that he changed the wavelength, and suddenly he could read the messages. So the messages came through.
Wow.
So we used the Morse code. I have a fantastic sound designer called Marie Tueke, who created this soundscape using the natural sounds along that place on the coast. And, she put the microphone underwater and used the kind of bits of nature like dried husks and the wind. But she also used the Morse code messages in it as well. So if you listen carefully, you can hear the Morse code. And I wanted to play with the idea of the frequencies, so that in both senses of the word, it's kind of all the stories and the sounds and everything on different frequencies, but also the characters throughout history who frequented that place. So the ghost of the captain's wife, and that story, along with Marconi. So it's really like a kind of palimpsest. You know, there's lots of layers there, which you can see in the rocks, but also the stories that layer that place, that, you know, we're just kind of trying to reveal glimpses of them.
So let's talk about this idea of a palimpsest. For those who don't know what that is, it's the idea of drawing over a prior work, effectively, or sort of over the traces of something that was there before. And this is really an extraordinary concept that we're seeing in the show this year, because these multi-layered experiences are precisely that. They're the ability to discover and peel quite literally like an onion, one level after another over repeated viewings, and using spatial audio perhaps, or the fact that the key point of interest may be shifting around the sphere. Another piece that we have at the show this year called Monte Gelato is a 5-year-long project where they placed films, 180 different films, contextually in the correct place in a 360 location in Italy. And here with your piece, again, we explore this idea of not just visual and auditory layers, but those of meaning and context and history. And the fact of having the piece in the festival is itself the door to further learning and understanding and investigation. And I love that we're able to bring something that might feel at first completely enigmatic and almost inaccessible, like a beacon, as a departure for conversation about these ideas and topics. So take us a little bit further into the choreography of this piece and its sort of hypnagogic, you know, rocking back and forth state, and the very deliberate and slow tempo of the movement therein.
Well, I worked with performers who had a dance background, a dance and movement theatre background, and one of the techniques I use in this kind of devised work is that we research a lot of the stories, you know, around a place, but then I get the performers to tell us the story in their own words. And as they're telling it to you, they're gesturing and they're moving and they're animating the story. And I note those movements down because it says to me what the key things were for the performer. And so then we put those together with the words that are connected with them. So like, I don't know, like thrust and stabbed in the stomach. And we create a dance out of the story that the performer told us. And because it comes from them, it's very connected to them. And I think it feels natural for them then to be able to perform that. So that's how we created the piece. It was from the two stories about the captain's wife. And I wanted to have the two women who are kind of the captain's wife, you know, sometimes she's seen in black, sometimes in white. And the Gareth, who is kind of the captain, he's also a sort of gatekeeper, I suppose, you know, because there are lots of stories of shipwrecks and refugees who drown trying to come ashore there, and the whole kind of immigration thing and having to offer up your belongings in order to enter somewhere. And so he's kind of signaling in a way like a beacon, but they're trying to copy him and understand how they get past, how they get permission to enter this place. So they've got their suitcases and the copper balls that they offer are actually connected to the Marconi story, because when Marconi arrived in Britain in the late 19th century, he brought all his paraphernalia for his radio, his wireless, which included these copper spheres. But at the time, they were very fearful of an assassination plot on Queen Victoria. So they thought they were bombs and they confiscated them. So this was a disaster for him because he couldn't make his apparatus work at all without them. So he went to a local ironmonger's and he saw these copper ball cocks that you use for toilets. And he realized these were the perfect things. So he used those for his experiments, and they worked. So when they open their suitcases, they offer up these copper ball cocks as a kind of gift to enter. And I mean, I like the kind of theatre where not everything is laid out on a plate for you. You know, it's like a kind of dream. And I love that about VR. It has this kind of dreamlike quality. It's kind of hypnotic anyway. And so I love to exploit that and create this sort of otherworldly atmosphere that you don't necessarily know what it means, but it stays with you, I hope. That's what I want, is for people to feel like they've witnessed an act of senseless beauty and kind of had a profound experience, even though they don't necessarily know why.
I completely agree that is the effect, and that is my favorite use of the medium, is that it allows you to set someone's consciousness in a place, in a setting, and be transported and transmogrified through that process. And yes, that when we give unexplained or unspecified cues, then the brain starts to work away at it, and it takes it into the dream state and says, what am I supposed to do with this information? Happen with films, but when you do have a complete sensory takeover, then we're processing more than we recognize at the moment of capture.
Yeah, and I think your brain makes connections. You know, it tries to make connections, and for me, that's part of the interactivity, even though this is a passive experience, in that you don't, press buttons or manipulate objects or anything. But I feel that if things are not laid out and spelled out for you, you're interacting in a different way because your brain is trying to make those stories. And it's what it means to you, ultimately.
The idea of the mimicking or the imitation in order to pass the gatekeeper is really a profound one, and it's one that we see so often. Just last night I was on TikTok looking up millennial versus Gen Z fashion and watching these two generations go back and forth about their sort of new fetish around previous styles, and the millennials making fun of the Gen Zers for looking like boomers all over again. And this idea that you have to imitate to sort of be accepted by the gatekeepers, and seeing all these kids thinking they're being so different and so counter culture, but repeating these very well-trodden tropes back and forth is both a hazard and a lesson to learn. When I was about 5 years old, my mother put on an experimental play called Becoming, and in it there was a bunch of completely white-dressed, white-faced people that spoke in only vowel sounds and moved like trains. And there was a woman who was in a pawn show and sort of turned into a butterfly, but she was trying to assimilate with these strange beings from this new land. And she simply couldn't imitate their patterns. And so she gets essentially cast out and has to come at it from a different way. And this idea of becoming has always been there for me. So it's one that I understand. And we have to be mindful and courageous enough to tread and make our own path. And yet also you have to sometimes just respect what's there. And you hear about Americans going into Europe and acting like they own the place and they expect everything to work the way that it is back at home or whatever the case may be. And that has its own problems. So just that conversation is one that I think is worth considering.
Yeah, I think it has many, many layers. And I think, if you watch it a few times, you might get different things from it. Part of the reason I did it in the first place was around communication, because we were in lockdown and we had this kind of 5-mile radius that we could travel within, and Lavernock was just outside my 5-mile radius, which meant technically I couldn't go and visit my husband's grave. And that sort of separation of not being able to communicate in in that very kind of symbolic way, which echoed the not being able to communicate with someone once they've gone as well, was all around us at that time because of not being able to see people in the flesh under COVID. And this idea of communication with Marconi as well, of trying to send signals across the airwaves and not having any idea actually how it worked, and that it wasn't going straight, it was going up to the ether and then down, and it just seemed very connected in a way. And then once the lockdown lifted, of course, it was just fantastic to be able to come together with the performers and actually work in the same space. And we all spoke about that kind of craving that we'd had for connection. So a lot of that kind of informed it, and of them being apart on the beach and signaling to each other, of trying to communicate without language but through gesture from a distance, was wrapped up in that. And then the two languages, that was kind of a way of decolonizing the whole thing, because the English language is so prevalent and so dominant that Welsh really, we're struggling to survive at times, but we are still surviving. We are still here, just like the dinosaur bones on the beach, and the people that managed to reach the shore. And it's also that kind of survival was connected with it. I'm probably rambling now.
No, this is just the best ever. Keep going forever. I did want to close with that element of the piece where you have the language and it's being translated and it's placed in situ in the world. We've seen a lot of pieces about language and preservation, and they're not all successful attempts. I mean, people are trying to figure out how to use this medium to capture language and preserve it. We've seen everything from, things that ask you to repeat something to looking at comparisons between the two, or hearing it. And to me, it's one of the most important things we can do. I speak 4 languages, and I know that there are certain thoughts and ideas that I can only really process or comprehend in a particular language, and that I can much better understand a culture and place through the language of it. So tell me about that element of the piece and how you wrote it out and what you were thinking in its creation.
Well, I wanted Welsh to be equal with English, and we live in a bilingual country here, and I just wanted the Welsh. It's a very important part of my identity and the history of that place. Welsh was spoken there long before English was, and it's a bit like that remains and that survives and persists, and there's a beauty to it and a musicality to it, and if you're bilingual, then you get more out of it, I guess. But they're both there on the rocks for you to read. And I also wanted it to be accessible to deaf people, so that they could still get something from the story, even if they can't hear the narration. And I just think that the narration with mixing the Welsh and the English is also kind of contributes to it being quite mesmerizing in a way. It's sort of hypnotic, it's it just kind of throws your brain a little bit off kilter because you're hearing something else along with the English. So it makes it more dreamlike in a way.
You seldom hear people in the world speak it unless it's sort of like a handshake. But I had the opportunity to work with Peter O'Toole, and he would drop into it every once in a while, and it was just like it was just completely mystical as an experience, because he seemed to wake up when he did it, when he spoke it. But I don't know where to access it. Where does it exist? Where do we find it?
Well, you can learn it on Duolingo and apps like that. There's Duolingo or Say Something in Welsh, or there's lots of online courses for Welsh. I think Welsh music is definitely a good way to get into it, and bands like Super Furry Animals, and literature or films. To watch Welsh language films, but I guess to actually learn it as a language, some app like Duolingo.
But what do you like as far as films and books, and as a representative of wonderful examples? Like if I was going to say to someone to learn English, I might tell them to check out something that's fairly sort of standard, but if they really wanted to get into some of the interesting bits, I'd say read like Cormac McCarthy or Harlan Ellison, or somebody who plays with language, Well,
in terms of films, there's quite a lot of good Welsh language films that maybe don't break out too much, but there was one called Patagonia from some years ago. There's one that's just going around. I think it's just opened in theatres in the US called The Feast, which is a horror film, which I haven't seen yet, but it's made by a friend of mine.
Fun. Halloween viewing.
Yeah, definitely. And that's in Welsh. And there's Welsh language television on Netflix.
Is there?
Yeah.
Good, I'll seek it out.
I'll send you recommendations.
I love it. Well, there's a channel on this Discord that we have called Panel Discussions, and certainly feel free to drop in anything there, not only about this part of it, but your work and other projects that you may be working on in the future that you'd like us to look from before, or the other performers or creators. We're really delighted to have you, and thank you so much for enriching our festival, and congratulations on this effort.
Thank you for asking me. I'm delighted to be here.
And to everyone who joined us today, thank you. We thank you for making the effort and taking your time and being as cool as you have to be to have found your way here. And we wish you a good day and see you soon.